The air in Charleston, South Carolina, on April 12, 1861, didn't smell like jasmine. It smelled like salt, sulfur, and a fear so thick you could chew it. For years, the North and South had been two countries under one flag, a marriage held together only by threadbare compromise. The catalyst was not slavery alone, but the fundamental question of sovereignty. Did the federal government rule the states, or were the states free to leave the Union they voluntarily joined? In the affluent, sun-drenched library of the Drayton family estate, just miles from Fort Sumter, this crisis was personified by two brothers, Elias and Thomas. Elias, 28, a lawyer educated at Harvard, believed ardently in the preservation of the Union. He saw the Constitution as a sacred, perpetual covenant and secession as anarchy. He also believed, quietly, privately, but fiercely, that slavery was a moral abomination, though he dared not voice this too loudly in the heart of the Confederacy. Thomas, 26, a West Point graduate and cotton planter, was a firebrand. He saw the new Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, not as a leader, but as a tyrant threatening the South's constitutional right to property and self-determination. For Thomas, the economic engine of the South, King Cotton, was inseparable from the institution of slavery. He saw his enslaved workers not as people, but as vital capital, protected by the very documents Elias held sacred. "You call it property, Thomas," Elias argued one evening, his voice low, "but you forget the 3/5 compromise was a political necessity, not a moral endorsement. Lincoln simply means to restrict its expansion, to contain the moral decay." Thomas slammed his wineglass down. "Containment is strangulation, Elias. The moment we allow the North to dictate our economy, our very way of life is forfeit. We are not British colonies, subject to foreign will. We are sovereign republics. If the compact is broken by their aggression, we must assert our independence. It is a matter of honor and states' rights." Elias only shook his head. "It is suicide, and the cannon fire will not distinguish between a man defending his honor and a man defending his humanity." The next morning, the thunder began. Part 2. The Crucible of War, Iron and Blood. The bombardment of Fort Sumter was the starting gun. Thomas, already commissioned as an officer in the newly formed Confederate Army, rode out in his freshly pressed gray uniform, leaving a frantic note for Elias. "The first blow is struck. The fight is not for slavery, but for liberty." Elias, despite his Southern roots, felt compelled by a higher duty. He slipped north, catching a steamship to Philadelphia, and eventually joining the U.S. Sanitary Commission, seeing his duty not on the firing line, but in the gruesome field hospitals, aiding the injured of the Union cause. The reality of the war, however, was far from the romanticized notions of Southern chivalry or Northern righteousness. It was a grinder. The First Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, 1861. This clash shattered the illusion of a quick, clean war. Civilian spectators from Washington, D.C., expecting a picnic and a show, fled in panic alongside routed Union soldiers. It was here, in the chaotic dust and smoke, that the legend of Stonewall Jackson was born, turning the tide with iron resolve. Thomas, fighting under Jackson, felt a surge of validation. God was on their side. The Battle of Antietam, Sharpsburg, 1862. This was the single bloodiest day in American history. Elias was there. In a cornfield and a sunken road, later chillingly renamed the Bloody Lane, over 23,000 men fell. Elias, splattered with mud and gore, treated men from both sides. He saw a young Confederate soldier bleeding out, clutching a worn Bible. The boy's last words were a whisper for his mother, not for the cause of King Cotton or Jefferson Davis. It was Antietam that gave Lincoln the strategic victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863. This crucial document did not free all enslaved people immediately, but it redefined the war. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was now a war for human freedom, preventing European powers like Great Britain and France, who had already abolished slavery, from recognizing the Confederacy. Part 3. A Line in the Dust. Gettysburg. The summer of 1863 brought the war's ultimate inflection point. Gettysburg. General Robert E. Lee's audacious push into Pennsylvania aimed to pressure the North into a negotiated peace. Thomas, now a major, found himself on the third day, July 3rd, part of Pickett's charge. He stood shoulder to shoulder with thousands of Confederates, lined up against a mile of open field, facing the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The Union artillery was relentless. "Fix bayonets," the order roared. As they marched, a magnificent but suicidal spectacle of Southern courage and misplaced faith, Thomas saw the men around him vaporize under the Union grape shot. The charge failed, devastating Lee's army and marking the high watermark of the Confederacy. The battle proved that the Union, despite its internal divisions, could and would resist. Meanwhile, Elias was closer than he knew. He was part of the immense Union medical effort near the battlefield. A list of severely wounded Confederate officers arrived at his station. He scanned it, his heart freezing. There, scrawled in hurried cursive, Drayton, T, Major, SCINF. Thomas was alive, but captured, his left leg shattered by a minie-ball. Elias found his brother in a crowded, stench-filled Union Field hospital. Thomas was pale, gaunt, and burning with fever. "Brother," Elias said, his voice choked with emotion. Thomas looked up, his eyes hard and accusing. "You sided with the invaders," he rasped, though the life had bled out of his conviction. Elias knelt. "I sided with the law, and with a nation that has a chance to be better than its cruel past." He started to clean and rebandage the wound, his hands practiced and gentle. "It was about states' rights," Thomas insisted, the old mantra barely a whisper. "States' rights to do what, Thomas?" Elias finally challenged, meeting his brother's eyes. "To hold millions in bondage? To break the promise of the Declaration that all men are created equal? The war's cause was the defense of slavery. The war's purpose became the end of it. Don't hide behind political theory. The blood on your uniform is for cotton." The harsh truth hung in the oppressive air. Thomas had no answer. He was a broken man, not just by the minie-ball, but by the collapse of his world and the realization that the peculiar institution he had defended was the true killer of the Union and his own family. The war dragged on, Sherman's march to the sea, the siege of Petersburg, until the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse in April 1865. The conflict cost over 620,000 lives, shattered the South's economy, and fundamentally reshaped the American political landscape. Epilogue: The Long Shadow of Reconciliation. Elias helped transport Thomas home to Charleston. They found the Drayton estate ravaged by Union foraging, but standing. The enslaved workers were gone, scattered to their new, uncertain freedom. They never fully reconciled. They lived under the same roof, two ghosts haunted by the same war. Thomas spent his life arguing for the lost cause narrative, that the war was only about states' rights and heroism, not slavery, a myth that would poison American history for a century.
Elias, meanwhile, dedicated himself to Reconstruction, fighting for the civil and voting rights of the newly freed population, only to watch the promises of freedom be curtailed by the rise of Jim Crow laws and Southern resentment. The Civil War ended the Union's division, but it did not end the national argument. It redefined freedom, yet left the question of racial equality tragically unresolved. The war was over, but the fight for the soul of America, for the true meaning of liberty and justice for all, had only just begun. The unforgiven ground still waits for the final, honest reckoning.